Arjun Vedanth traveled thousands of miles from India to surprise his online girlfriend in Florida, but what he found behind her closed doors was far beyond anything he could have imagined. Liora Densmore seemed sweet, gentle, and kind online, but when Arjun Vedanth finally arrived to meet her, the truth waiting inside her house would change his life forever. Arjun Vedanth believed he was crossing the ocean for love, but stepping into Liora Densmore's Florida home was stepping into a nightmare carefully orchestrated by a hidden network. When Arjun Vedanth landed in Florida to meet Liora Densmore, he didn't realize that her online persona hid secrets so dark he might never leave alive. Arjun Vedanth thought he was meeting his soulmate, but Liora Densmore's home was more than just clutter. It was the center of a terrifying experiment he was about to become part of.
Arjun Vedanth had always lived a quiet, predictable life in Hyderabad. His work as a freelance systems tester kept him indoors for long hours, and his evenings were spent browsing online communities where he felt more understood than in the crowds outside. He had never considered himself lonely, but he often sensed a space inside him waiting to be filled, by understanding, by companionship, by something he could not name. That space grew smaller the day he met someone calling herself Liora Densmore. She appeared one night during a live stream about self-improvement. Her comments were brief, but thoughtful, and her profile picture caught Arjun's attention immediately. It showed a soft smile framed by curly hair, and the glow of her screen reflecting in her eyes. Her posts revealed pieces of her life in Florida, sunlight through palm trees, handwritten affirmations, and warm captions about healing from emotional wounds. She presented herself as someone who had struggled yet remained gentle. Arjun found comfort in her presence almost without realizing it. Their online conversations grew naturally. Liora often encouraged Arjun to talk about his job, his interests, and his insecurities. She never pushed too hard, but always seemed to appear when he needed someone to listen. Her messages often arrived late at night, written in a calm, soothing tone. Arjun felt understood, maybe even cared for, in a way no one else had managed. Over time, he found himself thinking about her throughout his day. Even mundane tasks felt lighter knowing he would talk to her later. Liora rarely showed herself on video, claiming poor health and emotional vulnerability. She sent only close-up photos of her face, always taken from the same angle, always softly lit. Arjun found them beautiful. He grew convinced that meeting her in person would reveal the deeper connection he felt through the screen. When she expressed doubt about worthiness and mentioned feeling ashamed of her health issues, Arjun felt a strong desire to comfort her. He believed he could prove that their relationship went beyond physical appearance. He surprised himself with the intensity of his devotion. He began planning a trip to the United States without informing her. He imagined it would be a gesture of love, something that showed his sincerity. He believed she would be overwhelmed, in a good way. For the first time in years, he felt excited about the future. He saved money for months, carefully planning flights, accommodation, and local transportation. He reread their messages countless times during the process, reassuring himself that she would welcome him. When the day of the flight finally arrived, Arjun carried a mix of hope and nervousness. As the airplane lifted off, he imagined scenarios where Liora would smile nervously but happily when she saw him. He imagined taking her to the beach, helping her feel confident again, showing her that she was valued. Every hour in the air strengthened his belief that he was doing something meaningful, something brave. Florida greeted him with bright sunlight and humid warmth. He felt a surge of anticipation as he approached the address Liora had given him. But the moment he reached the quiet suburban street, unease crept into his thoughts. Her house looked nothing like the bright photos she shared online. The paint peeled from the walls, the windows were covered with boards, and the yard was filled with overgrown weeds. A mailbox stuffed with old letters suggested neglect. A neighbor watering her lawn paused when she noticed him standing on the walkway, observing the house with confusion. Arjun climbed the creak in his steps to the porch, telling himself that appearances could be deceiving. He reassured himself that Liora might be struggling financially or emotionally, explaining the condition of the house. He reached the door with a hopeful heart, unaware that the threshold he was about to cross would pull him into a web of secrets far more disturbing than he could ever imagine. Everything he believed about Liora, her life, her body, her reality, was about to be shattered in a single moment. The truth inside that house would mark the beginning of a nightmare he never expected.
Arjun stepped inside the house cautiously, expecting a modest, quiet home. Instead, he found himself inhaling a dense, stale air that clung to his lungs. The entrance opened into a narrow passage where piles of cardboard, clothing, and unopened packages formed crooked towers against the walls. The only clear path through the clutter looked as if it had been carved by someone barely able to move freely. Nothing about the interior matched the warm, serene life Liora presented online. The living room was buried under layers of possessions. Old electronics, rusted kitchen tools, and plastic bins stacked so high they nearly touched the ceiling. Arjun tried to steady his breathing as he stepped deeper inside. The floorboards groaned beneath his feet. A faint odor of disinfectant drifted from somewhere in the house, but it wasn't strong enough to cover the underlying smell of decay. He noticed dozens of unopened parcels addressed to Liora, some from medical supply companies and others from unfamiliar private sellers. It was clear she had been receiving equipment and items regularly, yet the packages had never been opened. As he continued, Arjun realized the only light came from small gaps in the boarded windows. Shafts of dusty sunlight revealed a strange pattern on the floors, thick drag marks, as though heavy objects or a heavy person had been pulled repeatedly across the wooden boards. A prickling sense of unease spread through him. Then he heard it, the soft hum of machinery vibrating through the house. It was rhythmic and strangely industrial, not the sound of a fan or HVAC system. He followed the noise toward the back hallway, where he found a doorway sealed with a heavy electronic lock. The keypad beside it was old but functional. Arjun noticed the panel was slightly open, as though someone had last used it in a hurry. He pushed the door gently, and to his surprise, it released. Beyond it was a ramp leading downward, dimly lit by fluorescent lights. The temperature dropped sharply as he descended. The hum of machinery grew louder, echoing off reinforced walls. This part of the house looked nothing like the cluttered floors above. It looked constructed, planned, almost clinical. At the bottom, he stepped into a wide room with metal beams supporting the ceiling. Thick electrical cables snaked across the concrete floor, feeding into large machines that surrounded a massive, reinforced bed. Medical monitors beeped softly. Oxygen tanks lined the walls. Cooling units emitted a constant low vibration. And in the center of the bed lay Liora. Nothing could have prepared Arjun for the sight. She was far larger than he had ever imagined, immense, immobile, nearly swallowed by the custom-built medical structure around her. Her body weighed around 380 kilograms, according to a digital panel glowing faintly beside the bed. Her limbs rested on padded supports, and her skin bore marks from long-term pressure. Tubes connected her to various monitoring devices. Arjun stood frozen, his mind struggling to reconcile the woman from the photos with the woman before him. Liora's face was still recognizable, but rounder, heavier, marked by years of confinement. Her eyes flickered open weakly as she noticed him. Arjun felt an overwhelming wave of sadness, shock, and fear all at once. But the deeper he looked around the room, the more disturbing details emerged. Dozens of documents were pinned to the walls. Weight records, feeding schedules, behavioral assessments, and charts mapping her emotional responses. None of these looked like personal medical notes. They looked like research data. Labels on some documents referenced an entity called the Hemlock Institute. an organization Arjun had never heard of. The forms were stamped and color-coded, tracking Liora's life in precise measurements. They documented her weight fluctuations, her compliance levels, her sleep patterns, and her interactions online. Arjun found pages describing subject interaction patterns, listing names and online handles of people who contacted Liora. His own username appeared repeatedly, evaluated for emotional consistency and predictive behavior response. Every message he had ever sent her had been analyzed. His growing affection had not been a secret. It had been monitored. As Arjun absorbed the horrifying truth, he felt the sensation of being watched. He looked up and saw cameras mounted in every corner, each one tracking him silently. Someone, somewhere, had been observing not only Liora, but now him as well. The realization sank into his bones. This house wasn't just Liora's home. It was part of a controlled environment, a study, a containment zone. Arjun stepped back from the screens as a wave of cold dread tightened around his chest. Every instinct told him he should run, but the narrow corridor behind him felt like a trap, waiting to snap shut. The stale, refrigerated air burned his throat as he tried to steady his breathing. His eyes kept darting around the room, scanning for anything that could explain what he had just seen. Instead, he found more evidence that pushed him deeper into panic. A metal cabinet near the walls stood slightly ajar. Inside were rows of neatly labeled vials, each filled with clear or pale yellow liquids. Some labels read metabolic suppressant, mobility inhibitor, an appetite conditioning compound. Others had only numerical codes, meaningless and yet deeply threatening. Next to the vials lay surgical tools, sealed in sterile packaging, as if someone had prepared for procedures that never happened or happened frequently enough to require replacements. He turned toward Liora again. Her eyes were open now, alert yet exhausted, flickering with a mixture of fear and helplessness. Her breathing was shallow, aided by a small machine that rhythmically released controlled bursts of air. Arjun realized she wasn't simply unable to move because of her size. Something else was limiting her, something chemical, something intentional. The monitors above her head displayed data streams, heart rate, body temperature, oxygen saturation, but a separate monitor on the far side of the room caught his attention. It displayed a live feed of multiple screens, chat windows, video call logs, scrolling text, timestamps. He recognized his own messages, displayed along with detailed notes assessing his psychological vulnerabilities. Other screens tracked user patterns from social platforms, tagged with identifiers like Target 46B and Target 52D. Arjun wasn't the only one. This place monitored dozens of people. Some screens showed message threads with strangers from across the world. Some conversations were still active. The Hemlock Institute wasn't just studying Liora, it was running a network built on emotional manipulation, hidden behind the facade of one isolated woman. Arjun's stomach churned as he realized Liora's role in all this wasn't voluntary. Her online presence had been carefully shaped. She wasn't allowed to show her real life, her real body, or her real suffering. Everything she had shared had been filtered, edited, crafted by people who controlled her living conditions. She had been used as bait, a tool to lure in vulnerable individuals, to analyze emotional responses and attachment patterns. The machinery hummed louder, and Arjun felt a sudden surge of tension in the air, as though the house itself had become aware of him. He noticed a blinking red light above the door he had entered through. It was no longer blinking, it was glowing steadily. That small change told him he had triggered something. He approached the ramp leading back upward, but his path stopped when a reinforced metal barrier slammed down from the ceiling, sealing the exit. The sound vibrated through the floor, echoing like a warning shot. Arjun froze, staring at the solid steel wall inches from his face. Whoever monitored the cameras had just locked him inside the lower level. His heart began to pound uncontrollably. He backed away slowly, scanning for another exit, but all he saw were bolted walls, locked cabinets, humming machines, and Liora lying helplessly in the center. The corners of the room seemed darker now, and the faint buzz of electricity carried an unsettling rhythm. Then he saw movement behind a glass panel near the far wall, a shadow shifting, silhouetted against dim lights inside a small observation room. The figure wasn't close enough to identify, but it was unmistakably human. Someone had been sitting behind that glass, waiting for him to find his way down here. His mind raced with impossible questions. How long had they known he would come? Had Liora been forced to keep him emotionally hooked so he would eventually show up? Had every message he sent sealed his fate a little further? He felt a terrible realization settle heavily within him. He had not traveled across the world to surprise his online girlfriend. He had walked directly into a system designed to trap him, study him, and decide what to do with him. As the shadow behind the glass moved closer, Arjun understood something even more horrifying. He was no longer a visitor. He was now part of the experiment. Arjun's pulse hammered against his ribs as he stared at the shadow moving behind the observation window. The glass was tinted, making it impossible to see the person's face, but their movements were calm, deliberate, and unhurried, exactly the opposite of the panic consuming him. The shadow lingered for a few seconds, as if studying him, then disappeared into darkness. A soft mechanical click echoed through the room, followed by the sudden activation of a row of overhead lights that cast a harsh white glow across the space. The shift in brightness revealed even more details Arjun had missed before. In the far corner, metal crates were stacked neatly, each labeled with numbers and barcodes. Some had warnings printed across them. Handle with care, critical equipment, property of Hemlock Institute. A thick binder sat on top of one crate, its cover stamped with the same institutional logo he had seen earlier. Arjun opened it with trembling hands. Inside were files describing experiments, case studies, psychological operations, and behavioral conditioning models. One section described attachment isolation testing, which outlined how subjects were chosen based on their emotional vulnerability and then encouraged into long-term communication with an online persona. The goal was to evaluate how far individuals would go financially, geographically, psychologically when emotionally invested in someone they had never met. Arjun felt a sting of humiliation as he realized he had been an ideal subject. Another section detailed controlled immobility environments. It explained how individuals like Liora were kept under strict medical supervision to ensure their dependence and isolation. They were given modified diets, medication cycles, and forced inactivity to maintain a physical state that aligned with the Institute's research goals. Arjun could barely bring himself to read the rest. Each explanation was colder and more clinical than the last. He turned toward Liora again. Her eyes were wet, her breathing heavy, as if she understood that he finally knew everything she had been unable to tell him. Her existence had been designed and maintained by people with no interest in her well-being, only in data. Arjun felt a painful mix of anger and helplessness rise within him. She wasn't just trapped. She had become a living instrument of someone else's studies. A faint hum changed pitch somewhere above him. He looked up and noticed a new red indicator light blinking near a vent, then another. The vents emitted a thin mist that spread slowly through the room. It was odorless, but Arjun recognized the threat instantly. The system wasn't trying to frighten him anymore. It was trying to control him. He covered his mouth with the collar of his shirt and backed away, but the mist remained gentle and steady, designed for long-term exposure rather than immediate harm. That meant they didn't intend to kill him. They wanted him sedated, compliant, manageable. They wanted him alive. He rushed toward the metal barrier blocking the exit, inspecting the edges for weaknesses, but the steel was fused seamlessly into the structure of the facility. There was no latch, no console, no access point he could manipulate. The walls were reinforced concrete, far too thick to break. The only vulnerable point he could see was the observation glass, but even that was likely reinforced. His vision sharpened with adrenaline as he scanned the room for something heavy, something sharp, something that could help him fight back. His eyes stopped on the metal crates. One corner of a crate was a pry bar wedged beneath it, likely used to lift the heavy container earlier. Arjun grabbed it, the cold metal grounding him for a moment. He approached the glass, unsure if he truly had a chance of breaking through, but determined to try. Before he struck, the lights flickered. A loud buzzing sound filled the room. A speaker crackled above him. No voice came through, just static, as if someone had turned on the system but chosen not to speak. The static grew louder, almost suffocating, then suddenly stopped. Another heavy door slid open on the far side of the facility. It was a door he hadn't noticed before, one blending seamlessly with the wall panels. Bright, calculated light spilled across the concrete floor. Whether this was an escape route or another trap, he couldn't tell. But he knew staying where he was meant becoming another victim of the Hemlock Institute. He tightened his grip on the pry bar, took a cautious step toward the open doorway, and braced himself for whatever waited inside. If he wanted to survive, and if he wanted any chance of saving Liora, he had to walk forward.
Arjun stepped cautiously toward the open doorway, every muscle in his body tense and ready to react. The light spilling from the room beyond was too bright, almost sterile, as though deliberately crafted to obscure what waited inside. The hum of the machines behind him continued in a steady rhythm, but the open door felt like a silent invitation, one he could not ignore if he hoped to survive. With each step forward, the temperature changed, becoming slightly warmer, less controlled, as though this section of the facility wasn't meant for the same kind of monitoring as the room behind him. He reached the threshold and paused, gripping the pry bar tightly. The room inside was larger than he expected, stretching out into a wide chamber with high ceilings and polished metal walls. In the center stood a massive circular platform, surrounded by rails, cables, and glowing panels. It resembled a stage or a laboratory testing zone, with thick wiring feeding into large machines along the perimeter. Strange symbols were marked on the floor, each aligning with a particular segment of the circular platform. Arjun realized this was not an escape route. It was another layer of the Institute's operation. Along the walls, he saw shelves filled with folders, digital tablets, and locked containers. A cluster of screens showed rotating profiles of individuals, faces of people he didn't recognize, alongside numbers, graphs, and charts detailing emotional responses, travel history, and behavioral patterns. The Institute wasn't studying just a handful of people. It was studying hundreds, maybe thousands. Then his heart stopped as a familiar face appeared on one of the rotating screens, his own. The screen displayed his age, occupation, travel records, online activity patterns, and even a psychological assessment that broke down his personality traits with disturbing accuracy. There were notes describing his loneliness, his need for emotional connection, his sensitivity to praise, and his tendency to attach deeply when shown affection. Arjun felt as if someone had carved the truth out of him and pinned it to the digital wall like a specimen. He forced his eyes away and scanned the room for any clues about how to shut down the system or escape it entirely. His gaze landed on a control panel at the far end of the chamber. The panel was lit with a series of switches and touchscreens, each labeled with cryptic terms like cycle reset, subject clearance, and phase progression. Some buttons were protected by transparent covers, requiring manual unlocking. As he approached the console, the screens flickered, switching from data displays to live camera feeds. One camera showed Liora lying motionless in the bed. Another showed the hallway leading back up toward the main floor of the house. Another displayed the exterior of the building, still, quiet, and surrounded by trees so dense it would take hours to navigate through them. A sudden realization hit him. The house wasn't located in a suburban neighborhood as he had assumed from the photos. It wasn't near any neighbors at all. This building had been constructed in isolation, far from roads, far from rescue. The static returned briefly through the speakers, followed by a mechanical clunk behind him. Arjun jerked around, nearly dropping the pry bar. The door behind him had closed, silently, sealing him inside the new chamber. He ran to it and pushed, but it didn't budge. He was completely locked in. For a moment he stood still, fighting the rising panic. The silence inside the chamber was heavy and oppressive. No voices, no movement, only the low hum of machinery and his own heartbeat echoing inside his skull. He forced himself to focus and approached the control panel again. On the corner of the console lay a stack of notebooks bound with metal clasps. He opened one at random. The pages were filled with handwritten logs, observations, instructions, behavioral predictions. One entry mentioned an upcoming subject reassignment trial, describing a process where a new individual would be isolated, monitored, and gradually conditioned to become dependent, just like Liora had been. Then he found an entry dated only a few days ago. It mentioned him by first name, noting that Subject 87C has entered self-induced travel phase. It described his flight from India, his arrival in Florida, and even the moment he walked into Liora's house. The final line chilled him to the bone. Containment protocol will initiate upon entry to lower sector. The Institute had been waiting for him. Suddenly, a loud mechanical whirring filled the chamber. The circular platform in the center began to rotate slowly. Metal clamps extended outward, clicking into place as if preparing for a new occupant. A spotlight turned on above it, pointing directly at the empty center. The realization hit him with crushing force. The Institute wasn't merely observing him. It intended to transform him into the next subject. Desperation surged through him, and he raised the pry bar, ready to smash the control panel or anything else that stood between him and freedom. He had no idea what consequence destroying the system might bring, but doing nothing would mean surrendering to the Institute's plans. He took one step toward the panel, and the lights abruptly went out, plunging the chamber into darkness. The hum of machinery ceased. The platform stopped moving. An eerie silence fell over the room. For a long moment, he couldn't hear anything except his own breath. Then, somewhere in the darkness, footsteps began approaching.